For this section of week 3.6 of the assignments here, we're going to be taking a look at 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12, looking at an amazing story, really, quite honestly, and especially as we see it in its context. One of the beautiful things I think about the Bible is that though there are heroes in the Bible that it lifts up for us, as we continue to live in the light of heroic actions in the past. And of all the Old Testament heroes, certainly David would be one of the great role models, or at least we would think so, because he is the great example of a great king. He is the one for centuries that followed David. He would be the one when they would want better times, they would yearn for the good old days of when David was king, and when and they would look forward to the day when an heir of David's would retake the throne and the glory would be restored. So David is one of those great characters of the Old Testament, and yet we see in the section today that the Bible does not gloss over faults, but it begins to tell stories of real humans doing things out of their relationship to God, or out of their own human willfulness and their own human faultiness, and we get to see it all on display. So let's take a look at that today as we look at chapters 11 and 12. And we talked about this briefly in the introduction, but I want to jump into it a little bit further. And if you have your Bibles, open it to chapter 11, and I'll have you do some reading as we go along and talk about some of the questions that this raises. This narrative begins to unfold for us. Again, it begins with, and we'll notice that it kind of ends in a similar way, in the context of this battle over the city of Ramah, where the headquarters of the Ammonites that David and his Israelites were in battle with. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. As I said at the beginning in the welcome, that David remained, even though this was the time that kings were expected to go out, sets the stage. The narrator is setting the stage for us to begin to question something is going to happen here. Obviously, it's amiss. And so what's going to happen? He's setting up this question mark for us. And then as the story goes on, and I'll have you go ahead and read through this, we'll be introduced to a number of other characters. The first character that we're going to be, the first characters we're introduced to, of course, are David, and we see his general Joab. But soon we'll be introduced to another couple, a woman by the name of Bathsheba, her husband by the name of Uriah. Later we will be introduced to another individual by the name of Nathan. He won't come in along until chapter 12, but we'll get a kind of an interesting character study here through chapter 11. And so I want to ask that you would stop the video, put it on pause, and read the rest of chapter 11, and then we will continue. Okay, I assume that you have had a chance to read through chapter 11, and you got a chance to see the story unfold, this weird tale of David's peeping Tomness up on the rooftop, seeing Bathsheba. But again, notice as you read the story, there's a couple of things that really begin to stand out. The questions down below are going to walk you through some of those questions. Notice the way the story is developed. How are the characters portrayed? Which characters receive a lot of development? Who do you really get to know about? For example, Bathsheba. What do you know about Bathsheba other than she was a beautiful woman while bathing? You don't know much about her. The narrator does not bring our attention to understand her. She is not a character who is developed. But we see that David and his motivations are on full display, as well as another character, Uriah, and his motivations are also on full display. What's going on in these warring emotions and these warring motivations, I should say, and how is goodness, greatness, leadership loyalty. How are these things on display? Where is the tension, the contrast between these two main characters of chapter 11? But walk through the other characters. Who do you feel sympathetic for? Who is the narrator kind of generating the story to draw you to their side? And notice things, as you read through it. Maybe read through it again, chapter 11, and ask that question. How is Bathsheba described? She is not probably ever mentioned simply by her name, but she's always mentioned by her name and a description of her, not in a physical description of her, but rather a description of her about who is she connected to in this world. So take a look again at chapter 11, begin to answer some of those questions, and then go ahead and read on to chapter 12. So here you go. Please stop the video and read on. Okay, as we're going to wrap up this question, there's a number of things I want to touch on again for you. It's kind of a sordid tale. There is much pain, and as you saw in chapter 12, that though David thought he had covered his tracks, those tracks were not covered to God. God saw. He sent the prophet Nathan, who now is introduced to us in this part of the story. And we see that there are consequences which are going to flow from David's sin. So this begins to raise up a number of questions for us as we begin to see it. And then the story concludes, of course, with Israel now returning to Jerusalem after laying siege and taking the city of Rabbah. So while it begins and ends with this siege of Rabbah, the story really has nothing to do with that siege, does it? It has everything to do with character and decisions that we make and the consequences of wrong decisions that we make. So again, take a look and just ask, who are the characters who drive the story? Where does most of the action happen? On which events does the narrator spend the most time? Because again, that is giving us a clue into what the narrator thinks is most important about the story. And so if we want to understand the narrator's point of view or the writer's, what he is trying to communicate, we need to look for these clues. And this is a great example of a contrast that the narrator uses to bring to bear a moral of the story. Though he never tells us exactly what the moral is, we are invited to catch it. Okay? So continue on, finish the assignment, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this section.